Today we're going to be looking at the artwork of Stephen Gammell, who's most widely known for his illustrations in the children's book Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. If you grew up in the 90s, you'll most likely be familiar with these drawings. Gammell's illustrations seem to lie in an area between pulp horror illustration and surrealism. While his works are considered commercial art intended to offer an uncanny visual stimulus to complement Alvin Schwartz's stories, let's not push him to the side as lowbrow art intended for children. I'd argue that even visual artwork from commercial literature has deep roots in art history, whether the artist was aware of this or not. Let's take a look at a technique used in all of Gammell's art from the Scary Stories books. In every one of these illustrations, it's easy to notice his extreme use of high contrast. This technique is intended as a way for Gammell to create a sense of urgency and drama within his images. High contrast in visual art is nothing new and dates back to its popularity in the late Italian Renaissance, where chiaroscuro was adopted as one of the canonical painting modes. Chiaroscuro paintings are defined by bold contrasts between dark and light. Although not the inventor of this technique, the artist most often attributed with chiaroscuro was Caravaggio. Caravaggio used dramatic illumination in his compositions in a term called tenebrism, which is derived from the Italian tenebroso, meaning dark and gloomy. This effect was achieved with his use of chiaroscuro lighting, in other words, high contrast. I'd like to point out that I'm not comparing the works of Caravaggio with Gammell's, but rather pointing out a technical style dating back at least 500 years. All techniques are human invention. It's important to try to learn the roots of these inventions so that we might gain a slightly clearer understanding of the visual language of art, if not just a little. With that being said, let's take a brief look at Gammell's concept. For me, it's hard not to notice an inspiration from the 20th century surrealists. An art movement 400 years after the Renaissance, surrealism was invented in Europe, mainly France and Belgium, just around the end of the First World War. In visual art, surrealists created often unsettling images of familiar subjects distorted or juxtaposed with invented objects intended to invoke the unconscious. The term unconscious dates back to 18th century philosopher Friedrich Schelling, but no doubt found its way into popular culture with the works of psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud. Freud's publications began gaining popularity in the decade just before the advent of surrealism. Let's take a look at one of the most famous surrealists, the Spanish artist Salvador Dali. In Soft Construction with Boiled Beans, we see a quintessential surrealist painting. Similar to Picasso's Guernica, this painting was meant to convey the horrors of the Spanish Civil War. Like a country in civil war, the creature in this painting is split into two distinct bodies fighting to destroy itself. Similar to Dali, Gammell's images combine the familiar with distortion and abstraction to create works that seem almost nightmarish. Whether or not Gammell was directly inspired by the surrealists of the 20th century is unknown to me, but there's no doubt in my mind that surrealism has had an enormous cultural impact that is still referenced to this day. So let's get into the drawing. On the screen now is the reference used for this. To make an accurate copy of Gammell's work, the first thing I'm going to do is set up a grid. I have a link down below in the video description that goes into a brief history of the artist grid and how to set one up. So once I have my contour lines in, I'm going to start adding in the values. The first area I'm going to work on here is the eye, and like we discussed earlier, one of the main techniques used by Gammell is extremely high contrast. So to fill this eye in, I'm starting with my darkest pencil, which is a 4B, and laying in a very dark value to fill out the majority of this eye. In my experience, a 4B is almost as dark as you're ever going to need. It's not that much lighter than an 8B, so I use this for my darkest value. To add in some base value just above the eye on the forehead here, what I'm doing is I'm switching to an HB pencil and I'm laying in horizontal lines that are parallel to each other. This is a technique I use in all my drawings, even realistic portraits. What I like to do is hold the pencil toward the middle back and use very light pressure. This gives me a base value to work in, so I can either start blending it with my blending stump like I'm doing now. This is going to help darken it and give some texture to it, or also I could erase into it if I want some highlights. So it's just your base layer to start either adding or removing values from. One thing I want to point out to anyone new to drawing is that when you blend with a blending stump, you're going to darken the value from the original pencil lines. When you draw with a pencil and add in some value, the graphite's kind of just sitting on the top layer of the paper. And then when you blend it, you're pressing it in and kind of smearing it into the fibers of the paper. And it's always going to darken the value slightly. So just be aware of that. It's always best to start light. You can start with a 2H or an HB and then blend into it to see what value you get, because it's always going to get slightly darker. Normally I'd start out with a 4H or a 2H at the darkest, but since this drawing is so dark in certain areas, I'm going right into an HB because I know I'm going to have to darken it up more than that. If we look around the eyes in Gammell's artwork, we'll see that there's these very dark shadows that are almost like creases or cracks in the skin. So to get these in, I want to make sure I have them very dark using a 2B or a 4B, and then I use a blender just to slightly soften the edges. But the most important thing is anytime there's a shadow, there's always going to be a highlight next to it. When the light's shining on something, it's illuminating one section, and then that part is casting a shadow in some other area. So make sure that every time you put in a dark area that there's always some highlight next to it. So moving along to the left side of the hair, Gammell has something interesting in almost all his drawings. He has these long squiggly type hairs coming out of almost everything, and it's kind of a signature of his. You'll even see them in landscapes at the bottom. It just adds an eeriness or a creepiness to his drawings, which I think add to the effect. While doing my research of Stephen Gammell, I found it's very difficult to find information about his techniques or exactly what his medium is. Here we're obviously using graphite, but it may be possible that he used watercolor or ink in his drawings, because some of the areas like the hairs look to be almost done with a very thin script liner brush with very dark black ink. But to keep this simple and make it easier on us, I'm just sticking with graphite. Now the thing I noticed with Gammell is when he draws his hair, he kind of pauses and moves the hair and shifts it in different directions constantly. It's kind of a strange way to draw hair, and also adds to the weirdness or the strangeness that he gets in his pieces, which makes me think that he used a brush with dark ink for the hairs in all of his drawings, because the lines are very sharp and they move very quickly, and it just looks like the type of thing that you get with a brush. But for me, it's really impossible to tell without seeing these drawings in real life. Now with Gammell's drawings, it's obvious that he invented these and they just came out of his mind. But here what we're doing is we're copying them in an attempt to try to learn some of the techniques he used. In my opinion, there's no better way to learn about an artist than to make a copy of their work. If you ever go to art school, this is called a master copy, and what it usually involves is learning some history of the artist and then going to a museum and working one-on-one with their artwork. So maybe spending a few weeks in front of it, copying it with paint or graphite, and this way you learn so much more about the technique as you spend so much time with the artwork. As we can see, the eyes are extremely dark in the reference, so I use that 4B to fill them in, and then what I did was I left the center of the forehead completely blank using the white of the paper. That helps contrast it, so we get very bright right next to very dark, giving us that contrast, almost chiaroscuro type look that is so prominent in all of Gammell's works. For the left side of the face, there's no secret to what I'm doing. I'm looking at my reference and doing the best I can to copy every little bit of shadow I see right next to every highlight I see. One of the problems I encountered while trying to figure out and learn the techniques of Stephen Gammell is that there seems to be no consensus online about what mediums he used in his works. A lot of it seems to be opinion-based, where some people say that he used graphite and charcoal, especially charcoal powder, to get those dark backgrounds and the black backgrounds, and then other people also saying that they were done in ink and watercolor. With the use of negative space in his drawings, it would seem to me that he's using some sort of either graphite powder or charcoal powder, or possibly even graphite or charcoal powder mixed with water to lay in a wash for the dark values. But then it definitely seems that he's using some sort of eraser or negative technique to leave those really bright areas and get that contrast between dark and light. To place in all these dark values on the chin and the neck, I started with a 2B pencil and an HB in some of the lighter areas, blend that in, and then switched over to a 4B. If you're using Tombow graphite pencils, their 4B is extremely dark, like I said before. It's almost just as dark as a 6B or an 8B from another company like Staedtler. Now, if you watch any of my other drawing or painting tutorials where I'm working on the mouth and the teeth, one of the things I always say about teeth is you want to keep everything subtle. You don't want to have dark lines between teeth, and you want to keep the values very light. This is going to make the teeth look clean, and it's just going to give a nice look to the image. For Stephen Gammell, though, he's doing the complete opposite here, which I really love and adds to that rotten look that this image has going for it. Every tooth has a very dark contour or line in between each one, and it makes them look like they're almost like they're rotting as they're twisting away from you. And again, it's just adding to constant high contrast and making the image have more of a drama or a sense of urgency to it. Although brights and darks are a theme in all of Gammell's work, One other thing I've noticed and learned is that he also has very smooth transitions between them. So one thing that I'm doing is, as soon as I lay down some graphite with the pencil, I switch over to my blending stump and try to use this to help smooth out the edges and kind of steal some of that graphite from the darker areas to some of the lighter areas, so I'm not drawing everything with the pencil. And once these values are down and blended smooth, I switch back to my eraser to pull out the thin little highlights that he seems to add so often in his artwork. The best way to see this, though, is for you to take one of his drawings and study it, and the best way to do that is by creating a copy of it. If you're watching this and know anything about Stephen Gammell's artwork or have any opinions on what mediums or techniques he's using, I'd love to hear it. It would be interesting to have a conversation going about his artwork. So if you have anything, just leave them down below in the comment section and I'll get back to you. I feel pretty happy with the values that I got here on the mouth and the lips using my eraser to pull out some of the highlights. So I'm going to switch over to the last part, which is the right side of this hair. One of the limits of using graphite for drawing is that it's difficult to fill in large areas that have a dark value, like the right side of this face here where the hair is. Something like this is so much easier to achieve with a paintbrush or an airbrush where you're laying in the value very quickly. So with the pencil, you just have to work slow and build the values up. This also goes back to my idea that he most likely used a brush with ink or some type of watercolor to paint in the hair. So to finish up this hair, I'm using my 4B to add in a lot of randomness and a lot of those flyaway hairs that he has in his work, trying the best I can to look at the reference and see where he decides to lay them in, because there are a lot of hairs you want to put in, but you don't want to go overboard with it. So that's going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a thing or two. If you have any questions or comments about Stephen Gammell or about this video, please feel free to leave them down below in the video description so that I can get back to you. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.